Hi, I'm here in the Martin Guitar Factory, and we're talking today with Chris Martin IV, Christian Frederick Martin IV, to be exact, and we're talking about the Martin guitars and the history of the Martin Guitar Factory. The first question I'd like to ask is, I'd like to ask you about your grandfather, your great-great-great-grandfather, in fact, that came over from Germany, and I'd like to ask you about his partnership with a man named Stauffer in making guitars, I believe in Germany.
C.F. Sr., as a young man, ended up in Vienna working for a renowned guitar builder named Johann Stauffer. Prior to that, he worked with his father in what was then my family's business of making furniture in Marknenkirchen. Took an interest in guitar building. His father encouraged him and actually assisted him in getting the job with Mr. Stauffer. Worked for Mr. Stauffer for several years, became one of the foremen in his facility, and helped to manage the guitar building enterprise. But ultimately, his goal was not to remain Mr. Stauffer's foreman for the rest of his life. His goal was to make the Martin guitar. And so he broke away from Mr. Stauffer and moved back to Marknenkirchen, where he hung out his shingle and began to build Martin guitars. Unfortunately, the violin makers, who were members of a very strong guild at that time in Germany, didn't want him to build guitars. They really felt that that was something that they should be allowed to do, and that the cabinet makers, which my great-great-great-grandfather was a member, should focus on furniture. And there was actually quite a row about this. They ended up in court, and our understanding is that in this particular case, C.F. Sr. won the court case, and the judge said, I think you should go ahead and practice your trade or your craft. You obviously have shown a great deal of interest and ambition towards guitar building. Go ahead, follow your bliss. Well, Marknenkirchen was a small town, and I'm sure there was a lot of animosity after the court case, and we do know that at some point in the early 1830s, C.F. Sr. made the decision to pack up his family and his tools and emigrate to the New World.
And of course, the obvious question I have to ask is, why was it located in Nazareth, Pennsylvania?
In 1833, my family arrived in America, in New York City, opened up a small shop. Actually, downstairs, it was a little bit of a music store. They lived upstairs. CF also built guitars. Business was good. Americans took to the guitar. They appreciated the quality. They paid the price he had to charge for the quality that he focused on. Unfortunately, my family was not happy in New York City. And we have, in our safe, we have correspondence in German. We had it translated a couple years ago, and it's very interesting. It indicates that they had considered moving back to Germany. Not because business was bad, but just because they didn't feel comfortable. In New York City, it was, expensive, it was crowded, it was dirty. Fortunately, they had some friends, some fellow German immigrants who had also immigrated in the 1830s and didn't settle in Manhattan. They actually came to eastern Pennsylvania, and they said, through correspondence, they said, before you go back to Germany, why don't you come out and visit? You might find it more comfortable here. And in the mid-1830s, they came out to the Lehigh Valley, took a look around, and they found what is today called the Pennsylvania Dutch, which is kind of a misnomer. It's really Pennsylvania Deutsch. And this part of Pennsylvania was settled by German immigrants, so they found people who spoke German, cooked German food, and in fact, I've been to Marknenkirchen, and this part of Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley, looks remarkably like Marknenkirchen, so I'm sure they felt very much at home. And in 1839, they closed the facility in Manhattan and moved full-time, permanently, to Nazareth. Well, actually, they moved to Cherry Hill. They weren't allowed to live in Nazareth because at that time, Nazareth, Pennsylvania was a closed religious commune founded by a persecuted German religious sect called the Moravians. And it wasn't until 1858, I believe, that the town incorporated itself. And if you go to their historical society and read their translated archival material, it will say, and I quote, "We let in the outsiders." And that's when my family bought a piece of property at the corner of North and Main and built my family's ancestral homestead and what we today call, actually it was just the beginning of the old factory.
And Chris, let me ask you, was there ever a buyout offer of the factory from an outside interest?
I'm not really sure, although I imagine there might have been, prior to when my grandfather was involved in the business. I do know my grandfather told me that Charlie Kaman came to visit him, and Charlie was very successful building helicopters and had a keen interest in guitars, guitar playing, guitar construction, and indicated to my grandfather that he would love to buy the Martin Guitar Company. My grandfather thanked him profusely, was thrilled to death that he loved the guitar, and said no. And of course, Charlie went on to found the Ovation Company, which is still a very viable going concern today. I remember visiting with my father. The gentleman at CBS was actively involved in buying musical instrument companies. They had already bought Steinway and Fender and the Meinhardt flute. And we went over to the CBS booth and went to the inner sanctum. There was an old elderly gentleman sitting behind a big desk. And my father and he shook hands. And my father introduced me. He said, "This is my son, and my son and I have had a talk. And he indicates to me that he has an interest in joining the family business. So my answer to you is that no, we're not going to be selling the Martin Guitar Company to CBS." The irony of that story is that they would have paid my family in stock, not in cash. And regardless of the fact that none of the musical instrument acquisitions performed well enough to benefit the CBS Corporation, CBS as a corporation did spectacularly well after that. And we probably could have sold some of the stock that we got when we sold the company, generated some cash, and bought the company back from CBS, because many years later, CBS divested themselves of all the musical instrument acquisitions. Today, I get calls constantly from people that are private equity investors. They have a keen interest in buying, not all the company, because they know that if they bought all the company, those of us that run the company might leave. So what they want to do is buy some of the company and get a seat on the board, and then watch us make money for them. I really have no interest in doing that.
Okay, and as I understand it, Chris, that from 1916 to 1931, you guys did subcontract labor for a company called Ditson, and made some guitars and ukuleles for the Ditson Company. Is that correct?
During the 1920s, actually starting in the mid to late teens, we began to build instruments for the Ditson Company. Ditson was a very successful music store chain out of Boston, and they had an interest in us building high-quality guitars for them under their brand, which we did. We've done that in our past. If you look in our history book, you can see there's several occasions where we built guitars for other people under their brand. Probably the most significant instrument to come out of that partnership was the early development of the Dreadnought. And at that time, initially they were gut string, they were 12-fret, slope-shouldered guitars, but they were really the reason that we were able to introduce the Martin Dreadnought guitar in 1931, because we had this history of building them for the Ditson Company.